Buffalo was what it was because of steel.
My father, my brother, and my sister all worked in the steel plant.
Every family was connected with the plant in some way.
And it was 4th of July every day for us because sparks were flying every which way.
It was like a science fiction movie, and it was just amazing.
It was like you'd come home from work and you'd still be seeing the same guys you saw at work.
There was a sense of camaraderie. There really was.
Yeah, self-contained little neighborhoods.
Everybody knew everybody. Everybody looked out for one another.
It was really an amazing place to work.
This program has been made possible in part by Western Regional Off-Track Betting, a public benefit corporation providing financial support to communities throughout the region. With over 45 locations providing racing action from tracks across the U.S., Western Regional Off-Track Betting is proud to be a public benefit corporation. And by the members of WNED. Thank you.
You can't build a country without the occasional piece of steel.
By 1900, the United States was a leading producer of steel in the world. Steel helped to make America an industrial and economic powerhouse.
You think of the American idea of growth. Things like highways, steamships, railroads, steel's in all of them. In the first half of the 20th century, you want a buzzword for this country, the buzzword could have been growth. And think about growth without steel.
As steelmaking grew, so did the big cities of the Northeast.
Every city has got some reason for being there. Buffalo's was heavy industry.
That logic, which said a big steel industry ought to be in a major city, was actually a new idea at the turn of the century, and so Buffalo rides that wave.
What Buffalo had an advantage in was electricity. By the middle 1880s, going into 1890, they had figured out how to harness Niagara Falls. A good, inexpensive supply of electricity. Buffalo was poised for growth.
In 1899, a Pennsylvania steel company decided to relocate its operation. The availability of electricity and Buffalo's proximity to Great Lakes and rail transportation made it a natural choice for the new steel plant. In 1904, Iron Age magazine called the newly built Lackawanna facility the greatest individual steel plant in the world. It was the start of a major new industry for Western New York.
By 1910, 10,000 people in the Buffalo area worked in the iron and steel industry. Big plants, tiny plants. There were about 150 iron and steel manufacturing facilities in the area. In a sense, there was sort of the down-the-street steel factory practically everywhere in Buffalo.
In 1922, the steelmaking landscape in Western New York changed dramatically. Bethlehem Steel, the second largest steel company in the United States, acquired and modernized the Lackawanna facility.
You had this feeling that Bethlehem Steel was the Rock of Gibraltar. This was not a mom-and-pop steel plant.
Bethlehem in the 1930s made the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge. They built part of Rockefeller Center in New York City. They built the Verrazano Bridge. They had a market on this kind of structural steel.
You name it, if it was made out of steel, the odds are good that it could have come out of the Lackawanna facility.
By the 1940s, Bethlehem's Lackawanna plant was among the largest steelmaking facilities in the world. It employed over 20,000 workers on a 1,300-acre site.
Well, if you're heading west on Route 5, everything on the right-hand side was Bethlehem Steel until you got to Lake Avenue.
When I first came up here from Erie, Pennsylvania, I couldn't believe that we kept driving by it and by it and by it. It just never ended. You know, and it was just, my God, is this one plant?
At one time, it paid 75% of the city taxes. And you had 22,000 employees at peak employment, so yeah, it was, Bethlehem Steel was synonymous with Lackawanna.
For the thousands of steelworkers in the Buffalo area, steelmaking was often a family affair.
There was hardly a family that didn't have somebody either worked for the steel plant or a subsidiary of the steel plant.
Every family was connected with the plant in some way.
It was kind of cool. Like sometimes father and son working in the same mill, going out the gate together. Father and son go in the bar, have a shot and a beer, go home.
My father, my brother, and my sister all worked at the steel plant. We were what they called a steel plant family.
My father had 50 years. My brother Stanley had 37. My brother Ted had 30. I had 32. My 4 cousins had over 30 years apiece. All one family surname. There was almost 300 years of service to Bethlehem, the Plandowski name.
And both of my grandfathers worked there. And my great-grandfather worked there before it was Bethlehem, I think it was Lackawanna Steel, and got killed in a plant. So really the history goes back over 100 years, and our careers all overlap, so it was continuous.
It was a culture. It was a culture. Every family I can think of growing up with, they were all connected to that place one way or another.
The old timers used to say, I started when ships were made of wood and men were made of steel.
Steelworkers were considered the quintessential blue-collar workers. They were a special breed, and the places where they worked a unique environment.
Anybody who never saw the steel plant in operation missed something. I always told my kids that. They really missed to see what it was like to make steel, because it's something to be seen.
Everything was big. The ladles were big, the trains were big, the cranes were big, the wrenches we used sometimes to loosen bolts were 5 feet long.
I just couldn't believe it. It was just so exciting. There were so many bells and whistles and sirens, and it was so hectic.
When the coke was ready, when the blast furnace was going to tap out, when the open hearts were going to give you steel, everything was made for that moment, and then boom, 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 let's go.
And it was 4th of July every day for us because sparks were flying every which way.
It was like a science fiction movie. It was like something you see in a James Bond movie, and just your eyes are going, wow, you know. Or the first time you walk into the BOF, the basic oxygen furnace, it's mammoth, and this ladle pouring steel is just amazing.
They had like ladles where they would open the gate. The steel would be running like water into a ladle. It was amazing. I had never seen anything like it. I mean, believing that steel runs like water, it was just amazing to me that you would melt steel down and it just run.
While the process was impressive, steelmaking was no easy task.
Most of those jobs were physically demanding.
It was a very difficult and demanding work.
Everything was big and noisy, and it was dirty. There was smoky. There were fumes around.
No matter where you work in a plant, I mean, there's an inherent danger, but you just accept it and you live with it. And if you've been there for any length of time, you'll have some close calls. There's no question about it. It's just the law of averages.
You absolutely have to have an awareness of the movement of equipment, the sounds associated with that movement, what the sirens mean when you hear a siren. There's heat everywhere. There's danger everywhere. It's something that you got used to, but you never forgot about it. You never let it away from your mind.
We used to have people get killed at work. You know, it was easy to get hurt if you didn't follow the rules.
In my interview before I started on the blast furnace, the guy held up a piece of steel. And he said, "Do you know what this is?" And everybody say steel. He said, "No, this is the remains of a human."
The work environment of the steel mill forged bonds among the workers.
There was a sense of camaraderie. There really was. I worked with the same guys probably 30 years. There is a sense of camaraderie. And you tell war stories. You know, you lie a little bit, but they're war stories.
It was just an awesome camaraderie with the people that I worked with. They taught you, they trained you, they looked out for you, and they taught you the meaning of certain things that you need to know when you walk through the shop and you're part of the steel-making process.
That camaraderie was strengthened by everyone in the steel plant being a member of the union.
When I started, there was 5,000 guys in our local. 5,000 guys. In one local. 300, 400 guys in a labor gang alone. It was just phenomenal. It was just phenomenal.
One thing about union labor in industrial environments is they tend to be very well paying, relatively easy to learn in that they don't require a huge education, but they are hard work. A steel worker would be making, I don't know, say $12 an hour in a particular year. He would earn half that pretty much anywhere else.
And the unions provided that certain middle income living, and there's no question about that. And whether that's good or bad, some people don't agree with that, but I think it helped out, no question about it. It was a comfortable living. It wasn't early.
The workers who came later to the steel mills owed a debt to the men who fought to form the unions.
People, struggled against the companies and struggled to form the unions in the 30s.
It was a tough job, and that's one of the reasons why the unions flourished, just because of working conditions.
I remember my father painting fences at the Holy Cross Cemetery every 6 months or so because there were always wildcats striking in that. They were always on strike. Those guys were always on strike. They didn't have nothing. They didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. They paid the dues. That's who paid the dues. Grandpa and Dad paid the dues over there.
Steelworkers Union was a very powerful one. It could be argued that the steel industry bought off the union for labor peace. Wages kept going up.
I had an old-time union leader tell me once, when things are good, you fight for money. When things start getting bad, you fight for benefits. When things get really bad, you fight for jobs. The steel industry was a major part of the city.
But it was a complete way of life that defined families and communities.
Life in the steel mill reflected what was going on in American society, including the issue of race relations.
Everybody seemed to have gotten along, but there was always separations between blacks and whites. It wasn't said, but it was there.
There was a lot of racism. Bethlehem Steel was, to me, back then, a segregated community.
When I started in the strip mill, there wasn't one black person in there. I remember going there and looking around thinking, wow, there are any black guys working here?
While the union ensured pay equity between black and white workers, there were other forms of discrimination within the mill.
It seems as though at that time blacks had the hardest and the dirtiest jobs, I put it that way.
They would slot the black guys over where the hot work was because somebody had this brilliant idea that they could deal with the hotness better. I'm not sure that was just a cover for doing that. A lot of guys came over with a big chip on their shoulder too because they knew what was going on. They had been excluded.
But I guess everybody resolved themselves to the fact it's a job. So you be as professional as you can and do your work.
For many steelworkers, a job at the steel mill meant security. But workers and their families were frequently impacted by the inconsistent nature of the steel business.
As those orders go up and down, then the labor goes up and down. Well, they'll say, well, we're going to shut down for 3 weeks, or we're going to shut down for a month. Come back in September, and we'll pick things up again. Orders come in, you call back the workforce.
I think it was so much a part of your life, it was inevitable that you're laid off, things were tough, and you're living on unemployment checks. We had years where I collected more unemployment checks than Bethlehem checks. The fortunes of the plant, that's how that affected your day-to-day life.
I'm guessing out of the first 15 years there, I was laid off half of them anyway.
You might be only working 6 months or so, but that's the way it was in the steel industry. It was boom and bust.
$1969, 6.9 million tons of steel. That might be the heyday.
Making steel was hard, dirty work. But for the people of this area, it had rewards.
Keeping the steel moving in Lackawanna was money. And you made money, the people that were making steel made money.
The steel plant paid good wages. There's no question about that. And back in the 50s and 60s when I started, it was not difficult to get a job.
It was busy. You assumed that every dad in Buffalo had a job.
Back in 1948, I literally pounded on the doors of Bethlehem Steel and says, "Can I have a job?" And they said, "Come on in."
Their help wanted signs were up, and there was opportunities for people, all kinds of folks to get, and all kinds of skills to get jobs at Bethlehem Steel, and Republic and the other steel plants around.
But you add them all together, it's not unusual to say you had 40,000 jobs. And good paying industrial jobs. These weren't, minimum wage jobs. These were good paying jobs.
I started at $2.83 an hour, and I thought I died and went to heaven. That was a lot of money.
People make good money. They have reasonable priced homes, low taxes, and they got a lot of money to spend. And that's what you had. You had people with a lot of money in their pocket.
For many, working in the mills was their gateway to the American dream.
Back in 1962-63, I had an opportunity to work at the steel plant at $2.28 an hour. So that was more than the cops were making, that was more than the firemen were making. Teachers weren't making that much. The times were really good. All three of my boys went to college. Bought a house when we were married 2 years. Kids got bigger and had to get a bigger house. It was a good time.
I put 3 kids through college, and you made a good enough living and, to lead a good life. Sure, you could afford a home, you could afford a new car. If you work steady, yeah, you could live fairly well.
Growing up, I thought about all the friends I had who worked at the steel plant. You know what? They went on vacations, they had decent cars. Some of them had cabins in the country or boats or things like that.
When I was a kid, everybody didn't own a car. My father walked to work for years and years. By the time I worked at the steel plant, everybody in my family had a car. So we didn't own a car when I was a kid. We had 7 cars when I was 20. That's a huge change in people's lifestyle.
With that era with the middle class, I mean, we were all kind of striving together, but we didn't know we were middle class, you know. There was nothing in our 1040 that said, well, if you reach this income, you're middle class. Everybody strived to own a home in the suburbs, buy a car, a decent car. They had their kids going to Little League. You were constantly busy doing things, but you never really thought of yourself as middle class. You were just trying to better yourself a little.
Buffalo used to be one of the 10 largest cities in America. It was a big, booming, rompin', stompin' city. Part of it is because guys and women were working 12-hour shifts day in, day out, building car plants, steel plants, making things work. We still have some of that attitude here.
I take pride in everything that I do, to be honest with you. And my father instilled in me, no matter what you have to do, you do it well enough to put your name on it. So therefore, you don't have any regrets. And that's what I've taken through life.
There are still many, many steelworkers, former steelworkers here in Western New York. They take a lot of pride in what they were able to accomplish here in Western New York.
But the great thing about working at Bethlehem Steel for a young man was that it was an offer of promise. If you think about that plant and the people who lived in Lackawanna through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, the plant was big and it represented people working, and it meant people had money to buy things. And it was a future for a lot of people in Buffalo.
I always thought of it as just this big, dirty, ugly looking joint that was where my father had to work because he didn't have a good education. And I really didn't see the beauty of what they did in that place. It was really an amazing place to work.
People helped each other. It was a neighborhood.
It was like you'd come home from work and you'd still be seeing the same guys you saw at work. Guy down the street, he worked for the electrical machine shop. Guy down the street was general foreman of one of the big machine shops. 2 doors down was a friend of ours that worked in the strip mill with me. Next street over, a general foreman of the shipping department in the strip mill. There was a crane operator, inspector. They were just sprinkled all over the place. Steel guys.
Ask somebody where he's from. He'll say Lovejoy. He'll say Iron Island. He'll say Kaisertown. He'll say North Buffalo or the East Side or something like that. Yeah, self-contained little neighborhoods.
There were definite neighborhoods in Lackawanna, and a lot of it was ethnicity. The ethnicity of Lackawanna is remarkable, how many different ethnic groups.
The German immigrants were here, the Polish immigrants were here, the Italians were here.
It was cities within city. It was a good place to grow up.
Living in neighborhoods so close to steel mills had its own set of challenges.
You knew you were in Lackawanna because of the smell. You didn't notice it because I lived in it, all right? But whenever I'd leave and come back, I knew I was home because of the smell. At times it was pretty tough on the ladies that did clothes. All the coke that was up on top of the blast furnace would blow out into the air, and if a lady had white clothes hanging on a line, it would leave specks of black all over the clothes.
Well, I remember having a conversation with my next door neighbor who was complaining about the daily dust. And I remember telling her that was our bread and butter, so you better learn to put up with it. But she was from out of town.
Neighborhoods of the era were very different from today. They were self-contained places where everyone knew each other.
The number one thing I always say about growing up in South Buffalo when I was a kid is I never had a key to our house. We didn't lock our door, ever. We didn't even lock it when we went on vacation in case the neighbors needed to borrow something.
Kids lived outdoors from morning till night. And that was the daily routine. You went to school, you went out to play, went home for dinner, went out to play, came home and went to bed.
Older peoples knew all the children's. If you did something you wasn't supposed to be doing, they were gonna let your mother and father know. Everybody looked out for everybody. Everybody knew everybody. And things like this makes a neighborhood to me. It brings that unity.
I'll give you some of the nicknames of the guys I grew up with, and there's no BS, in the first ward. Bedbug, gator, chicken, ratbait, mumbles. This is a beautiful handle. The guy's name was Joe Kuchkowski. His nickname was Casablanca Joe. I mean, what a name. I mean, these were names that you couldn't make up, and they stuck them on the guys according to the way they acted. If you were a chicken, you were a chicken. You did it once, you were stuck with that name. I mean, fantastic. And that's how you shape the neighborhood.
Pretty much everything you needed was walking distance. And that was almost like in, every neighborhood. Maybe 6, 7 blocks down, there was another neighborhood.
Where I grew up in Buffalo Park, you had a tavern, 3 grocery stores, 2 delicatessens, a movie theater, a pool hall, a shoemaker shop, all in that area.
You had these little stores, today they call them mom and pop, but what they were is little individual stores. And that's where you shopped, and that's where you did your business.
Many of the neighborhoods grew into prosperous communities throughout western New York.
It was a booming, busy place. Downtown Buffalo was just like any of your major cities, many things to do.
Lackawanna was like Times Square. It was going constantly. Friday, which was payday, you couldn't get down Route 5.
I'll tell you, on a Friday and Saturday night, you couldn't move in Lower Lackawanna. Sidewalks were like you were in Vegas. They were just teeming with people.
Ridge Road back then was like Buffalo's Main Street, would be people walking around. It was just great.
You had nightclubs and bars and, all kind of activity. So there was no reason to go anywhere. People used to come to Lackawanna, as a matter of fact. So it was a hotbed of activity because there was so much money flowing.
Every corner had a tavern, I swear, and one of the first things the guys would do coming out of the steel plant would head for a tavern and have a few beers. It was a steel worker's thing, shot in a beer.
With the decline of steelmaking, many of the old neighborhoods exist only in the memories of those who once lived there.
Back the bridge, not back of the bridge. I'm from back the bridge. Oh, basically everybody knows that term.
That was the east end of Ridge Road as it went over the railroad tracks out of the main part of Lackawanna. That was a little city of itself down there.
The Ridge Road Bridge at that time was the Mason-Dixon line of Lackawanna.
Once you cross the bridge, that runs into South Park. Blacks was on this side of Ridge Road. Whites lived on the South Park Ridge Road. At a certain time, once it got dark, blacks didn't go across Ridge Road. Whites didn't come across Ridge Road.
You could bring up the bridge to anybody who lived in Lackawanna at that time, probably to this day. They put a new one up, but and they would remember the bridge, period.
I still get tears in my eyes when I drive by there.
Over the years, there were always rumors they were going to close the mill. I mean, there were people that just never believed that that would happen.
People couldn't imagine a United States without a strong steel industry. What are you going to build stuff with?
But the older guys saw it coming. They saw things change radically.
I never thought the steel plant would ever shut down, but it did.
The signs of decline were there for many years. The end came in December 1982, when Bethlehem Steel announced the end of steelmaking at its Lackawanna facility.
When they shut steelmaking, 1982, I was on vacation, and I heard it on television.
This is a sad day for the Lackawanna plant and for the people who have worked here.
What are your feelings? You know you only got a few more days to go.
I feel bad about it. Take my livelihood.
What are you going to do now?
Nothing.
We've had many generations of proud steelworkers pass through these gates and many tons of quality steel.
We went into work Monday morning and people were saying, did you see the press release? What are you talking about? They're shutting the plant down.
Oh, God. It was devastating. It was really devastating.
The righteousness and nobility of having a job was gone.
Everybody knew me as a steel worker. And then it got to be, well, I don't have a job. I'm no longer a steel plant worker.
So no one really knows, I think, what a person really goes through unless they go through it themselves.
I was angry, I was scared. You know, I put the best years of my life, you know, most of the best years of my life down there, my young years. And then all of a sudden, bang, and it stopped.
The very last day that I worked at Bethlehem, and I stripped the last heat of steel that was made at the BOF. And I remember when I got done, I pulled the handles, shut the crane down, and I walked off. As I was walking off, I was thinking, I'll never see this again, never do this again.
And you know, you ever hear of the old adage like, last one, shut the light off and close the door? I did that in the dispatcher office. I just picked up my stuff, emptied out my locker, and closed the door, flipped the switch for all the lights in the room. And there's a kind of a little bit of sadness that comes into it, you know, that, what the hell am I doing? I'm not going to come back here again, you know.
For steel workers who had spent most of their lives working in the mills, it was hard to let go. Many held on to the hope that steelmaking would return to Western New York.
You know, there are actually people that still thought they were going to start up again someday.
For years, people didn't believe it, till the bricks crumbled and it came down.
I mean, they were actually taking buildings down, and guys were still saying, they're just trying to scare us. When the buildings are falling down around you, you gotta, at that point, you know, realize that they're not kidding.
The wages and security of the steel industry helped create Buffalo's working middle class. Gone with the steel mills were the many things that helped to define that middle class lifestyle.
You didn't get a new car every 2 years. You don't go on as many trips. You can't send your kid to this college. It's just the way life is, and you do adjust to it.
I thought it would be easy to find a job and make that kind of money.
I was actually making, probably when I left, I bet I was making $27 an hour, I think, in 1982. The next job I took was for $5.50 an hour, and I worked at it for 2 years.
Everything changed, and the face of the nation changed.
With the end came the inevitable questions of how did this happen? And frequently, who was to blame?
Every person, every group has their opinion on why it happened. I think the demise cannot be placed in one bucket. It's a number of different factors, from labor to management or mismanagement to foreign steel.
Countries that were once customers became competitors. And you just could not compete with, because they're paying their employees a fraction that we were making.
It's much harder to see the big picture than it is to see or to say, well, it's the union's fault, or it's management's fault, or it's foreign steel's fault. It's all of the above.
In the end, the loss of the steel industry had a lasting impact on Western New York and on the people who for generations made the steel that built America.
All of a sudden, it looks like a small plot of land. You said, man, there was a big building there. But sad, you go by it and it's just, it's quiet, it's dark, and you start thinking about what it looked like years ago. It's really it's a tough thing to accept.
And there's sadness about that too, because in some ways, you're getting a sense that your way of life is not valued in the next generation. So it's not all defined by the economic catastrophe. And I think there was more determination to somehow take what was best of that experience and find some way to carry on.
Each change of event have had a devastating effect on this city, but the city still holds its own.
The industrial legacy is going to follow this city for the next 500 years.
Buffalo was what it was because of steel.
Not too long ago, we went back into the slag piles. And I told my nephew, I said, Ronnie, see all this slag here? Somebody in our family, my family, was responsible for helping to make this slag from the day it started to the day it ended.
They had a lifestyle. It's the kind of lifestyle that gets celebrated in country music these days. That this was rough work, but it was our work, and we proudly did what we were supposed to do. A young man or woman who's, say, tearing tickets at a movie theater for a living probably doesn't have that attitude. Steel workers did.
I can drive my kids around and say, I built that bridge, I worked on that plant, I did this, and you take some pride in that.
And I had a gentleman tell me last week that worked for Ford, and he said the best steel they ever got was from Bethlehem Steel. It still gives you pride.
Every once in a while I run into somebody and we talk over old times, you know, how are you doing today? A lot of us guys still got a hankering to cut steel, weld steel, fix steel.
I think the memory of Western New York as a steel-making area is in the minds of those who tell the story. So the history is in the memory of those who can evoke it. And those who pay attention to the history from those who have memories are the better for it.
You know, sometimes late at night, when the steel plant was really going, you could be on the street and you could look out and the sky would be aglow from the steel plant, you know? And it was really amazing looking. And my father used to come out and he'd smile when he saw that. He'd see that big thing aglow and he'd say, there, that's our lifeblood. That was the kind of thing the old man was proud of. He liked to see that thing going.
And I look back on that time with a sense of warmness.
I have absolutely no regrets for every single minute I spent in the steel industry. Met some wonderful people. I still have contact with some wonderful people. Despite all the ups and downs, the moves, the uncertainties at times of what's going to happen, I view it as a totally positive experience.
Yeah, it was a proud place to work in. I enjoyed, like I say, if I could go back to basic oxygen furnace today, and I could go back there with the same guys, I'd go back. I'd go back. It's hard to say, but I'd be there.
Yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood called Bethlehem Park, which is just off of Route 5, and right next door to the strip mill. So most of my life has been spent, my first 24 years, living right next door to Bethlehem Steel.
Got a phone call, and they said, I'm looking for a Murphy who lives in South Buffalo, and he works at the steel plant. And I said, well, that could be about every other block.
And, well, one Saturday night I went down to the lake with a friend of mine, and we went partying. Come home Saturday morning, and we passed each other going through the kitchen door. And Dad said to me, he says, today's going to be a different day. He says, I'm bringing home an application for Bethlehem Steel for you.
At that time, it wasn't hard to get a job anywhere in Buffalo, to be honest with you. You could quit one, like I said, and go down the street and get another one. You had all type of manufacturing in the city.
There were a lot of extracurricular activities that guys did together. Each department had its own bowling team, for instance. And, you know, on like a Wednesday night down at Southside Lanes, the different steel teams would all go out there and bowl against each other and give each other the business and stuff. So I think guys were pretty good with each other.
Well, you knew everybody on your street or in the local taverns, steelworkers all over the place.
This program has been made possible in part by Western Regional Off-Track Betting, a public benefit corporation providing financial support to communities throughout the region. With over 45 locations providing racing action from tracks across the U.S., Western Regional Off-Track Betting is proud to be a public benefit corporation. And by the members of WNED. Thank you.